They called him the man who could buy anything, except a second chance at love. Ethan Cole. 38 years old. Self-made billionaire. The youngest CEO on the Fortune 100 list. To the public, he was a symbol of victory. To his rivals, a man to be feared. But to those who once dared to love him, he was a locked door. 5 years. That's how long it had been since anyone had seen him with a woman. And 5 years since the betrayal that turned his heart into ice. His empire stretched across continents, real estate, technology, luxury brands. He could silence a scandal with a phone call, move markets with a single meeting, and crush competitors without ever raising his voice. But he hadn't returned his mother's calls in months. Every day was a carefully calculated performance. Meetings that ended with applause. Headlines that praised his brilliance. Nights spent in the tallest penthouse in New York, eating alone while the city lights glittered far below. To the world, Ethan Cole was untouchable. But behind the tailored suits and perfect deals was a man who had traded connection for control. Love was risk. And Ethan never made investments that didn't guarantee returns. Then came the call that no amount of money could silence. His grandmother, the only person who had loved him without condition, was in the hospital. And just like that, the man who ruled empires would be forced to return to the only place where his wealth meant nothing. Asterisk. The next morning, Ethan Cole's calendar was already overflowing, back-to-back board meetings, investor calls, and $1 billion deal waiting for his signature. But for the first time in years, he hesitated. His driver waited in the lobby, holding open the door to the sleek black sedan that had carried him to every major victory. Ethan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the skyline as if seeing it for the first time. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted the moment he walked in. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. No one dared to interrupt. Ethan took his seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. To his left, a junior executive nervously presented the final phase of a corporate takeover, a move that would push hundreds out of their jobs. To Ethan, it was just numbers on a page. He approved it without a flicker of hesitation. An hour later, his face graced the financial news. Cole Capital secures historic deal. The world applauded. The market soared. And yet, even as cameras captured his every calculated smile, the call from last night still echoed in his mind. By evening, he was at a charity gala, the kind of event where diamonds glittered under chandeliers and the air smelled faintly of money and ambition. The city's elite floated from table to table, each one eager to be seen by him, each one waiting for the smallest sign of approval. Ethan gave them what they came for. Polite nods, empty compliments, a performance honed to perfection. But when the night ended, he returned to his penthouse alone. He poured himself a drink and stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the city's endless sprawl. For years, this view had been a reminder of his power. Tonight, it felt like a cage. The phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't silence it. The name on the screen read, Dr. Reynolds. Ethan, it's your grandmother. You should come. Soon. The ice in his glass shifted. His heartbeat slowed. And in that quiet moment, the empire he had built felt like nothing more than a house of cards. Asterisk. The next morning, Ethan Cole did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He cleared his schedule. No calls. No meetings. No deals. For a man whose life was measured in profit margins and quarterly reports, it was almost unthinkable. But the voice of Dr. Reynolds from the night before lingered in his head, and so did the unspoken truth in his tone. The drive to St. Augustine Memorial took him far from the polished glass towers of his world. The streets grew narrower. The buildings smaller. Storefronts faded under peeling paint. It was a part of the city he had left behind years ago, and never looked back on. At the hospital entrance, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewed coffee. The receptionist looked up at him, her smile polite but impersonal. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask for a photo. She just pointed him toward the elevator. When the doors opened to the third floor, he stepped into a hallway painted in soft pastels, lined with family photos and worn bulletin boards. The hum of machines filled the air, punctuated by quiet voices and the occasional laugh. He paused outside room 314, his grandmother's room, steadying himself before walking in. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. There she was, his grandmother. Frail, her silver hair tucked behind her ears, her face lit by a smile that was far too warm for the cold reality of a hospital bed. And beside her was a woman he'd never seen before. She wasn't dressed for anyone's approval. Comfortable clothes, hair tied loosely, a pen tucked behind her ear as she read aloud from a worn paperback. But what caught him wasn't her appearance. It was the sound of his grandmother's laughter, soft, genuine, unforced. It had been years since he'd heard it. He stood there, unnoticed, listening to their quiet conversation. The woman teased his grandmother about cheating at a crossword puzzle. His grandmother playfully swatted her hand in mock protest. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by people who calculated every word in his presence, this scene felt almost unreal. And in that moment, Ethan Cole, the man who had sworn never to open his heart again, felt the first flicker of something he couldn't yet name. Asterisk. His grandmother was the first to notice him. "Ethan," she said, her voice both surprised and warm, as if he were still the boy who used to sit by her kitchen table eating homemade biscuits. The woman beside her turned, meeting his eyes for the first time. No flicker of recognition. No rush to stand or impress. Just a calm, polite nod, as if he were any other visitor. "This is my grandson," his grandmother said proudly, patting his hand. "Ethan, this is Clara. She's been keeping me company when the doctors get too quiet." He extended a hand, expecting the firm shake of someone aware of his name and influence. Instead, she simply smiled faintly and said, "I'd shake, but your grandmother's in the middle of beating me at this crossword." No mention of his last name. No lingering look. No attempt to charm. It was disarming. For a moment, he simply stood there, studying her. She had that unpolished ease of someone who lived without pretense. A smudge of ink on her wrist. A faint line of tiredness under her eyes, suggesting she worked more hours than she should. "You've been visiting her often?" he asked. "Whenever I can," Clara replied. "She's good company." She glanced at the crossword. "And very competitive." His grandmother chuckled. "That's because I always win." Ethan found himself staying longer than he'd planned, drawn into the light banter between them. He wasn't used to conversations that didn't revolve around contracts, negotiations, or strategy. Here, in this small hospital room, none of that mattered. When visiting hours ended, Clara packed her bag without hurry, wished his grandmother a good night, and gave Ethan a simple nod before walking out. No request for his number. No glance over her shoulder. It was as if she truly didn't care who he was. And that was something he couldn't stop thinking about. Asterisk. That night, back in his penthouse, the city stretched endlessly beneath him, glittering with the same cold brilliance it always had. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't thinking about his next move or his next deal. He was thinking about her. The woman in the hospital room who had made his grandmother laugh. The woman who didn't glance twice at his watch, his suit, or his name. The woman who walked away without trying to leave a trace. In Ethan's world, everyone wanted something. A favor. An introduction. A slice of power. But Clara? She had taken nothing. The next morning, his driver raised an eyebrow when Ethan asked to be taken to St. Augustine Memorial again. "Twice in 2 days, sir?" the driver asked. Ethan didn't answer. When he arrived, he found Clara in the corridor, wheeling a cart stacked with books and crossword puzzles. She greeted him with the same polite warmth as before, no more, no less. "You're back," she said simply. "I wanted to see my grandmother," he replied. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't the full truth. Over the next week, he found excuses to be there more often. A quick visit before a meeting. Dropping off flowers he claimed his assistant had ordered too many of. Stopping by to check on her progress with his grandmother's crosswords. Each time, he learned something new. Clara loved old mystery novels. She brewed her own coffee in the break room because she hated the hospital's brand. She laughed easily, but there was a depth in her eyes, the kind that only came from surviving loss. And every time he left, he found himself wondering when he could come back. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. But the man who had once counted his worth in acquisitions and assets, was beginning to count it in moments. Moments spent in a small, pastel-painted hospital room, with a woman who treated him like a man, not a headline. Asterisk. It started with small detours. Ethan would tell his assistant to push a meeting back by an hour. He would choose the long route to the office, one that just happened to pass the hospital. And then, it wasn't detours anymore. It was intention. He began scheduling himself around those visits, carving out time he never used to give away freely. Board members complained. Investors grumbled about delayed calls. Ethan didn't care. At the hospital, he wasn't Ethan Cole, CEO of Cole Capital. He wasn't a headline. He wasn't a chess piece in the corporate game. He was just Ethan. A grandson. A man. He started helping Clara with small things, carrying supplies down the hall, reading aloud to patients when she was busy, pouring cups of coffee in the waiting room. Things so ordinary they would have seemed absurd in his old life. And yet, here, they felt like the only things that mattered. One afternoon, he found himself at the hospital garden, watching Clara help an elderly patient plant tulip bulbs. She was patient, encouraging, and unbothered by the dirt under her nails. He stood there longer than he meant to, just watching her smile. The next day, he skipped an exclusive rooftop luncheon to attend a hospital craft fair she had organized. The contrast was stark. Instead of champagne and white tablecloths, there were paper decorations, folding chairs, and homemade pies. He bought 3 slices of pecan just to make her laugh. And she did laugh. Not the polite, measured chuckle he was used to. A real laugh. For a man who had once lived only in the world of power and privilege, Ethan Cole was starting to see another world, one without red carpets, without private jets, without the constant hum of ambition. And the strangest part was, he didn't miss any of it. Asterisk. It was subtle at first, a quiet discomfort he couldn't name. The lavish dinners began to taste bland. The boardroom victories felt hollow. Even the applause from shareholders seemed distant. It wasn't that his world had changed, it was that he was seeing it differently. On Tuesday night, he sat at a long table in a private dining club, surrounded by the city's most powerful figures. Crystal glasses clinked, conversation buzzed, and yet, his mind wandered. He found himself thinking about Clara laughing over pie crumbs at the hospital craft fair. When someone at the table cracked a joke about people who waste their time volunteering, Ethan didn't laugh. In fact, for a moment, he felt something sharp twist in his chest. He realized he had been that person once, too busy, too important, too far removed from the world to notice what really mattered. Days later, during a strategy meeting, one of his executives pitched an idea to demolish a block of affordable housing to build luxury apartments. Normally, Ethan would have evaluated the profit margin and signed without hesitation. This time, he hesitated. The numbers on the page blurred as he imagined the faces of the families who would be forced to leave. Clara's voice echoed in his head. You can measure wealth in money, or in the good you leave behind. He didn't remember her saying it exactly like that. But somehow, she had been planting those thoughts in him from the beginning, not with lectures, but with the way she lived. And the more time he spent with her, the more he realized, his old life was no longer enough. Asterisk. It happened in moments so small, he almost didn't notice them at first. A rainy afternoon when Clara brought his grandmother her favorite soup, and Ethan found himself lingering just to hear their conversation. The way her voice softened when she read aloud. The way she listened without rushing to respond. One evening, the hospital was quiet. Visiting hours had ended, but Clara stayed behind, finishing paperwork in the break room. Ethan found her there, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose from its tie. "You're still here," he said. "So are you," she replied, not looking up from her notes. He offered to help, though he had no idea what he was doing. She laughed at his awkward attempts to sort files, and somehow that laugh felt warmer than the glow of any chandelier he'd ever stood beneath. There were other moments, buying coffee together from the small cart outside the hospital, where she teased him for not knowing how to order anything without foam or imported beans. Walking down the corridor carrying flowers for a patient who had no visitors, and watching her face light up as she handed them over. It was during one of those quiet evenings, while they stood in the garden watering the last blooms of the season, that Ethan caught her looking at him. Not the way people usually did, not with calculation, not with expectation. Just seeing him. For a man who had built walls taller than the buildings he owned, it was disarming. And under the dim glow of the garden lights, he realized something he had been trying not to admit. She was no longer just the woman who made his grandmother smile. She was becoming the woman who made him feel again. Asterisk. It was an invitation she almost didn't accept. A high-profile art auction, held in one of the city's most exclusive galleries. The kind of event where paintings sold for more than most people's homes, and where everyone knew Ethan Cole's name. "You don't have to come," he'd told her, as if giving her an escape. "Then why ask me?" She'd replied. "Because I want you there." The night of the auction, Clara arrived in a simple navy dress. She hadn't borrowed jewels or worn a designer label. Still, when Ethan saw her, something in his chest shifted. Inside the gallery, the air hummed with whispered deals and polite laughter. Waiters floated between guests with trays of champagne. Every head seemed to turn as Ethan entered with Clara at his side. Some looked curious. Others, critical. She stayed close to him, but he could feel the weight of the stares. A woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her companion and murmured just loud enough for Clara to hear, "Another charity project." Clara's smile faltered. Ethan noticed. He wanted to turn, to defend her, but the moment passed too quickly, swallowed by the noise and motion of the evening. They moved from painting to painting, but the ease they had in the hospital garden was gone. Here, in his world, the air was sharper, colder. Later, as the auctioneer's gavel fell on a final sale, Ethan glanced at her. She was polite, even gracious, but her eyes told him the truth: she didn't belong here. Or maybe, she didn't want to. And for the first time in years, the world he had built felt like a place he wished he could escape from. Asterisk. The drive back from the auction was quiet. City lights streaked across the car windows, but neither of them spoke. She kept her gaze on the passing streets, her hands folded in her lap. When they reached her building, he stepped out first, opening the door for her. She thanked him softly, about to turn away, but he stopped her. "Clara." She looked up at him, the cool night air stirring loose strands of her hair. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then he kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss he was used to, not calculated, not staged for a camera or a headline. It was slow, unguarded, almost hesitant, as if both of them were afraid it might vanish if they moved too quickly. When they pulled back, her eyes searched his. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, a sudden flash caught her attention. A camera. Somewhere across the street, half hidden in the shadows, a paparazzo had been waiting. The sound of the shutter was sharp in the stillness. The next morning, her phone buzzed with messages from friends. Headlines splashed across gossip sites: Ethan Cole's mystery woman, gold digger or charity case? Her stomach sank as she read them. The photos showed their kiss, cropped and framed to look like a calculated debut. She didn't answer when he called. Didn't reply to his texts. Because for all the moments they had shared, in the garden, in the quiet halls of the hospital, one night in his world had shown her exactly how dangerous it could be to step inside it. Asterisk. For 3 days, she didn't answer. Not his calls. Not his messages. Not the flowers he sent, left at her door without a note. When he finally saw her again, it was by accident. She was leaving the hospital just as he arrived, a tote bag slung over her shoulder, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. "Clara," he said, stepping toward her. She stopped, but didn't smile. "I can't do this, Ethan," she told him quietly. "I can't live under a spotlight I never asked for." "It was one photo." "It was enough," she interrupted. "Enough to remind me that we're from two different universes. In yours, one picture can become a weapon. In mine, I can't afford the damage it causes." He wanted to argue. To tell her that it didn't have to be like that. But the words felt small against the truth in her voice. "You think I can't handle your world," she continued. "Maybe you're right. Or maybe I just don't want to." And with that, she walked past him, her footsteps fading into the hum of the city. For the rest of the day, the boardroom felt emptier. His penthouse felt colder. Even the skyline, with all its sharp, glittering beauty, looked distant. He had spent years building a fortress around himself, walls so high no one could reach him. Now, for the first time, he wished someone would try. That night, Ethan didn't turn on the lights when he came home. The city glowed beyond the glass walls of his penthouse, but inside, the rooms felt hollow, like a museum of someone else's life. He poured a drink he didn't really want and sat in the dark, the silence pressing in around him. For years, he had told himself he preferred it this way, no distractions, no attachments, no one close enough to hurt him. But now he realized, it wasn't peace. It was emptiness. He thought about the last 5 years, the betrayals, the headlines, the carefully curated isolation. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that detachment was strength. But Clara had shattered that illusion without even trying. The next afternoon, he found himself at the hospital, but not to see her. His grandmother's room was quiet, the curtains half drawn, sunlight spilling across her bed. She was asleep, her breathing slow and steady. He sat beside her, watching her chest rise and fall, remembering the afternoons he had spent here as a boy, the smell of her baking, the sound of her humming in the kitchen, the way she always had time for his stories, no matter how small. When she stirred and opened her eyes, she smiled faintly. "You look tired, Ethan." "I am," he admitted. She studied him for a moment, as if reading the thoughts he couldn't voice. "Don't let fear keep you from the people who make life worth living," she said. "Money can buy you comfort, but it can't buy you home." Her words stayed with him long after he left. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't thinking about his next acquisition or the quarterly numbers. He was thinking about what kind of man he had become, and whether there was still time to change it. The decision came quietly. There was no dramatic outburst, no lightning strike of revelation, just a steady, growing certainty that the life he had built was not the life he wanted to keep. The next morning, he walked into the boardroom carrying nothing but a folder under his arm. The executives, mid-discussion, fell silent. They had seen him deliver bad news before, but never with this particular look in his eyes. "I'm canceling the Harbor Heights development," he said. A stunned pause. Then protests. "It's already approved. It's a guaranteed return." "It's wrong," Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but final. "We're not displacing those families. The project is over." They argued, they warned him about stock prices, about shareholders, about reputations. But he had already made up his mind. For once, the numbers didn't matter. Later that day, he called in his legal team and removed the most toxic member of his board, a man who had profited from cutting corners and stepping on those without power. By evening, his phone was buzzing with calls from journalists wanting a statement. He didn't give one. Instead, he drove back to St. Augustine Memorial. The garden outside was empty, the air cool with the scent of early spring. He walked the paths alone, remembering Clara kneeling in the dirt, her hands planting life into the soil. That was when he knew, this wasn't just about fixing a business decision. It was about fixing himself. And if that meant risking his comfort, his image, and the empire he had spent his life building, so be it. Asterisk. He didn't call ahead. He didn't send flowers. He didn't bring an entourage. 2 days later, Clara was in the hospital courtyard, helping an elderly patient water a row of planters, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there he was. No suit. No tie. Just jeans, a plain shirt, and dirt already on his hands. "I thought you might need an extra pair," he said. She hesitated, the weight of their last conversation still between them. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" He took a slow breath. "Changing things. Starting with this place." That afternoon, she learned what he meant. He had purchased the vacant lot behind the hospital, a forgotten piece of land overgrown with weeds and trash. And he was giving it to them. No strings, no conditions. It would be turned into a permanent healing garden, dedicated to his grandmother. But he didn't just sign the papers and walk away. He stayed. He pulled weeds. He hauled soil. He knelt beside her, planting seedlings, his hands blistering under the work. They talked as they worked, not about deals or headlines, but about favorite books, about childhood memories, about the things they wished they had done sooner in life. By the time the sun dipped low, the garden was still far from finished. But the air between them had shifted. Clara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the difference. This wasn't a gesture of wealth. This was time. Effort. Humility. And for the first time, she began to believe that maybe, he wasn't the same man she had walked away from. Asterisk. They stayed in the garden until the sky turned to gold. The air was cool, the scent of freshly turned earth lingering between them. Clara brushed soil from her hands and stood, looking over the rows they had planted together. "It's a start," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "So are we." She turned toward him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Ethan, why are you really doing this?" He didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but certain. "Because you made her smile in her last days. And because you made me remember what it feels like to be alive." Her breath caught, but she said nothing. "I don't want to go back to the way things were," he continued. "Not the empty rooms, not the cold boardrooms, not the endless chase for more. I want this. I want you. I want to build something real, together." For a long moment, she just looked at him, as if weighing the truth in his eyes. Then, slowly, a smile began to form. "You're a difficult man to trust, Ethan Cole," she said. "I know," he replied. "But I'm ready to spend the rest of my life proving I deserve it." And there, in the half-finished garden named for his grandmother, she took his hand. It wasn't an answer wrapped in grand promises. It was something better, a beginning. Asterisk.